What is the Russian world, and why was this ideology the reason from the very start of the aggression and later the occupation of Ukrainian lands by Russia? The answer should be sought in the depths of centuries. The Moscow tsardom lived and developed since its very foundation, almost exclusively by robbery and the occupation of neighboring countries. Over the last 700 years, from the middle of the 13th to the beginning of the 20th centuries, Muscovy, that later became Russia, increased its territory approximately 110 times, from some 200,000 to 22 million square kilometers, and the occupation of foreign states transpired under the guise of the specious ideas of Pan-Slavism and the protection of people of Orthodox beliefs or compatriots. Note that in the role of these mythical compatriots, Moscow arbitrarily chose totally different peoples, from Ukrainians to Finns. By the end of the 17th century, Muscovy remained a classic Eastern despotic state, with mostly non-Slavic people and a totalitarian political regime. But at the start of the 18th century, Tsar Peter I sat on the throne of Moscow. In his youth, he adopted the European culture and customs and began to redraw Muscovy to the European system. It began with the fact that he changed the Asian name of the country Muscovy to the more pleasant-sounding name of Russia. And then he began to rigidly reform the country, from the prohibition of men wearing beards and Asian kaftans by the boyars to the state building of the church.
І закінчуючи повним одержавленням церкви.
He invited and brought a number of brilliant scholars and craftsmen from Europe. Among them was the German historian Gottlieb Bayer, who had the task of writing the Europeanized history of Russia. Later, Empress Catherine II even founded a separate historic commission. It discovered that there was practically nothing European in the history of Muscovy. And then Empress Catherine II gave an instruction to assign the nearest European state to engage in its past regarding the horde of Muscovy. On our misfortune, Kievan Rus was the closest European state. So Moscow historians have invented a fable that Kievan Rus was the cradle of three fraternal peoples, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian. Moreover, the latter was recognized as the elder brother.
Саме твердження про те, що Київська Русь є колискою.
The very assertion that Kievan Rus is the cradle of three fraternal peoples cannot withstand criticism, even from the point of view of ordinary logic. What fool would put three children in one cradle? But since they're in the same cradle, they would have to be triplets. That begs the question, where did the eldest brother come from?
Взявся старший брат.
The concept of the formation of the three peoples and one cradle appeared sometime in the 18th century, and it was connected with the unified propositions of Moscow. It was necessary to finally unite all the lands that Moscow had been seized under its authority. The fact is that this was not about joining, but seizure. Later, imperialist Russian ideologies justified Russian aggression against neighboring countries with the completely messianic idea that Moscow is the third Rome, and that is why, by conquering other nations, Russia saves them from all that is evil. Imperialist ideologues did not determine what exactly Russian occupation rescued the countries from. For a while, they exploited the idea of Moscow Orthodoxy as a bona fide religion, so all Orthodox peoples should have been united under a single Orthodox Russian emperor. Years later, the Bolsheviks transformed this idea into messianic communism. They said the USSR was the only state of working people in the world, and then a permanent revolution will break out, and the USSR will become the leader of the whole world. If we compare, for example, with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, then the unification of the Russian lands, in particular the regions of Volyn, Bratslawshchina, Podylia and Kiev under the rule of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, everything was peaceful and the local residents were not armed. In those times, the Moscow Principality began to propagate the idea of its superiority.
Яке починає пропагувати ідею об'єднання руських земель в одну.
However, after 7 centuries of the siege of all the new territories, the empire collapsed, and for the first time since the founding of Muscovy, the Russian imperial nation began to lose lands conquered with massive blood spill. This incited a revanchist sentiment among the Russian elite. All the same aggressive imperial ideology was raised on the shield, but this time under the name Russian world. If we look at it out of context, the Russian world is nothing more than concerned for its compatriots living abroad. But Moscow understands this idea in the same way that Adolf Hitler understood it. The notion was the protection of compatriots by the accession into Sudetenland and then the Austrian Anschluss. Putin started the struggle for the Russian world from the annexation of Crimea and attempts at annexation of eastern regions of Ukraine. Political analysts call this Russian propaganda protection of compatriots. In the times of the Russian Empire, both authorities and the church that was controlled by them held a completely categorical position. The entire Slavic population of the Russian Empire was Russian. It was a privileged nation, so why divide it into some Belarusians or Ukrainians? But with the October Revolution of 1917 to 1921, it became clear that Ukrainians and Russians were totally different people. And then there was a need to explain one simple thing. If Ukrainians and Belarusians came from somewhere, historians had to figure out when this happened, while linguists, cultural scientists, and other scholars had to explain why 2 new nations split off from the mother nation of Russians.
Уже скоро стало зрозуміло, що ні за мовою, ні за...
It soon became clear that Belarusians and Ukrainians were not descendants of Russians, neither in language, culture, or mentality. They are not a sub-ethnos of the Russian nation. So this begs the question, if Ukrainians and Belarusians live on the territory of the former Kievan Rus, which the Russians regard as the root of their statehood, then what is the actual attitude towards the history of Kievan Rus of Russians, who live on the deep periphery of this state?
глибокій периферії цієї держави.
To answer this question, Soviet historians hastily fabricated the myth that if the Russians are equally as Slavic as Ukrainians and Belarusians, then they are descendants of Kievan Rus, which was the cradle where the mythical Old Russian people originated. So in the present day, 3 fraternal peoples, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, emerged from it. Moreover, the latter hatched faster than others and became the so-called elder brothers. If we talk about where Rus was emerging as a political organism, then Ukraine was definitely the center. The main supply of human capital for Rus's growth was provided by Ukraine. As for the same readiness of the population to serve in the Prince's Guard, again, Ukrainians provided the main source of human capital and labor.
Основний людський капітал тут давала Україна.
Kievan Rus had a rather typical way of development, from the monoethnic state of closely related tribes living around Kiev to a mighty medieval empire that united not only Slavic but also Finno-Ugric, Baltic and Turkic tribes. And at this stage, the development of separation between the metropolis and the colonies of Kievan Rus was very clear. The core of the empire were the Slavic lands of the old principalities: Kiev, Volyn, Siversk, Chernihiv, Turov-Pinsk, Polotsk, and others. All of them are located on the territory of present-day Ukraine and Belarus. An exception to this rule is only the Novgorod Republic, but it was completely independent from Kievan Rus and from the future Muscovy, which in those times was the state center.
Насправді формування України
In fact, the formation of the Ukrainian and Belarusian ethnic groups took place much earlier than the formation of the so-called Russian people.
багато раніше, ніж формування так званого російського народу.
This happened first and foremost because these ethnies were autochthonous in their territories. In the 5th to 6th centuries, Proto-Slavic tribes, known in the Byzantine chronicles as the Antis and the Sklauyeni, already lived on the territory of Ukraine and Belarus. Later, under the influence of external danger, these tribes were forced to unite in unions, and this became an impetus for the formation of proto-state structures. In particular, the constantly operating troops were the guards of the chieftain. Later, there arose the capital, where the Grand Prince sat on the throne. All the other leaders of the tribes paid tribute to him. When we talk about Muscovy, in this period and even later in the 9th and 10th centuries, poorly organized Finno-Ugric tribes of hunters lived in the present-day European part of Russia, in impassable forests. They did not know what a state was at the time.
Якщо ми говоримо про
When we talk about the Moscow Principality or the Great Moscow Principality, this is a colony, the fringe of the Slavic oikumeni. And if you look at the ethnographic point of view, in particular the preservation of ancient legends and other monuments of oral folk art, then why were they preserved there in Muscovy? Because they're the memory of the metropolis.
пам'ять про метрополію.
Yes, indeed, continuity of this or that state can be well followed, including through the prism of culture, in particular music. For example, the worldwide known Christmas song Carol of the Bells, that has Ukrainian roots. Its original Ukrainian words sound like this: Generous day, a swallow came flying. For modern Ukrainians, it sounds a bit strange that is sung in the winter during the Christmas holidays about the arrival of swallows. So it is not surprising that this song was written in the times when our ancestors celebrated the arrival of the new year with spring flowers. This can be traced through the most ancient folklore that has come to our times. After all, musicologists can study folklore so well that they will remove one layer of historical stratification after another. And then it will be the very grain that is very important.
Уже одне те, що щедрівку
Consequently, the fact that this carol has been performed in our lands for at least the last 1,000 years suggests that the indigenous population did not change significantly during this time. But this is a topic for the next program. And now remember that every phenomenon has its good and bad sides, it pro et contra.